Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this UCL Minds Lunch Hour lecture. We're really pleased to have you all with us today. My name is Emma Brooks, and I will be chairing today's session. It's a real pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sarah Young, who's here today to talk on the subject of staying in touch, maintaining transnational identities in the era of COVID-19. Sarah will discuss the challenges faced by migrants, especially teenagers, in trying to stay in touch with families and friends in the country from where they have come, something which has become harder still during the pandemic. Sarah is based at the UCL Institute of Education, where she's a member of the UCL Centre for Applied Linguistics and a lecturer on the MA Education. She's also an affiliate member of the UCL Centre for Modern and Contemporary Britain. Sarah is interested in questions of bilingualism and identity, with a focus on the interrelation between language and identity. She also studies the narratives of children and adolescents. Sarah has published widely on Polish migration and bilingualism in international journals, as well as writing for the LSE Brexit blog on the effect of Brexit on children. Most recently, Sarah has been working as a co-researcher on a project investigating how Polish Saturday schools in the UK have been affected by the COVID-19 lockdowns, in association with UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Today's talk discusses some of the findings of that project, but draws primarily on some of Sarah's earlier research, exploring the experiences of Polish-born teenagers living in the UK, and how they have tackled the challenges of staying in touch with friends and family in Poland. Before I hand over to Sarah, I'd just like to remind you of a couple of things. If you could keep your microphones on mute, that would be very helpful until we come to the question and answer session. The session is being recorded. If you'd like to ask any questions, you can do so via Slido. You were sent the link in the email as an introduction to this session. Okay. Yeah, we'll be taking questions via Slido at the end. And if you didn't receive it, you can go to Slido and enter the code LHL2. Okay, over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma, for your introduction, and good afternoon to everyone who's attending wherever you are at the moment. I'm going to put my slides on, so hopefully in a moment everybody can see that. Okay, so in the talk, what I'm going to be talking about is transnationalism, and in particular how it relates to the theme of Polish migration, particularly teenagers. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of the pandemic on transnational practices. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll talk with it, just go through it briefly. I'm going to talk about it, give a definition of transnationalism for those who are less familiar with the concept. And then I'll give some examples of transnational practices. I'll then talk about two pieces of research which focus on transnationalism amongst Poles living in the UK. But these are some things which could also apply to other groups of people in similar situations. Now, the first piece of research concerns the experiences of teenagers who are often overlooked in discussions about transnationalism, and how the way that they stay in touch with friends and family often differ from those of adults. And then I'm going to move on to a more recent study I've been doing, which also raises the question of transnationalism and how transnational practices are being affected by the current, or the ongoing pandemic. So what is transnationalism? It's been defined as the way that individuals attempt and manage to maintain their ties with places from which they've migrated, and how they maintain a sense of identity across two, or sometimes more, cultures and countries. Now, this can apply to a range of individuals. They could be refugees, people fleeing a country, and in which case it's often harder to maintain that connection with the country of origin, and if indeed an individual even wants to do so. It can apply to economic migrants, such as people working across the EU, for example, people who may have come to the UK from European countries, particularly maybe Eastern Europe, and who may be working in jobs such as construction or hospitality. But it can also apply to people who live and work abroad in other professions, perhaps those who enjoy a more comfortable economic situation, and people who've chosen to migrate because of work prospects or other considerations, rather than being forced to do so due to political unrest or economic pressure. Now, it's important to remember, firstly, that such practice is nothing new, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But of course, in the contemporary world, it's far easier to stay in touch than in previous eras. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, there are a range of different transnationals, and they may decide to participate in different practices. And it's partly out of individual choice, but it also depends on what practices are actually available to them. As I mentioned, one group of migrants that often gets overlooked in discussions about transnationalism is adolescents. These are children who often will have had no agency in their migration. They don't get to choose, but have either been sent or come to another country and are subject to many more restrictions than adults. And this may leave them unable to develop transnational identities in the way they might want to. Now, on the other hand, there are ways that they do manage to maintain contact with and to identify with their country of birth or their parents' birth, and I'll talk about these also. And of course, like so much else over the past year, transnational practices have also been curtailed by the pandemic, and I'll talk about this towards the end of my talk. So as I mentioned, transnationalism is nothing new, and I think that point is sometimes overlooked. It wasn't invented with the advent of Skype and EasyJet. Ever since people have been migrating, they've often endeavoured to maintain forms of contact with friends and family in the places from which they've migrated. Now, in previous times, this would have been through letters or sending packages and then phone calls when possible. And evidently, the modern world allows for a greater variety in the ways that people are able to stay in touch. In the case of Polish migration, as from many other countries, what differs from last century is the freedom to exchange information without being subject to letters or packages being opened en route or censored or telephone calls being intercepted. Now, that isn't to say that censorship has vanished in modern times, and there's of course the whole discussion about the privacy of what we're sending electronically. But the point I want to make is that it's a lot harder to stay in touch when your activities are being overtly monitored at state level. And another point is that there's perhaps less incentive to stay in touch with a country when you have absolutely no possibility of returning, which may have been the case for many Poles who emigrated in the mid part of last century and previously. So the practice isn't new, but modern conditions are quite different. There's greater scope for a range of communicative activities through technology, travel, freedom of movement between countries, and so forth. And this has allowed for various practices to develop, such as transnational parenting, which I'll discuss in a little bit. Now, again, some of these have been curtailed by the pandemic and also the big Brexit, but we'll have a look at some of the practices that might be considered transnationalism. So these include, but are not restricted to, the following. It may be that a person is sending money back home to supplement the family income by sending regular economic remittances. Indeed, that might be the reason for their migration, that going to work in another country allows them to save money in a way that would be impossible in their country of origin. They might simply be sending packages for birthdays or special occasions. For others, visiting is a possibility. And other practices, which were certainly far less available in the past, also include things like keeping up with current affairs, which of course we can now do through the internet, or just entertainment, following favourite soap opera that you used to watch back home. And of course, there's using technology for Skype, FaceTime, texting, things like that. However, as might be apparent from some of the activities on this list, these are not necessarily all practices that younger people may be involved in. And that's what I'm going to discuss next. So although this is changing, a lot of studies on migration focus on adults. There is work that looks at families, but this is very often from the parents' perspectives. But for children, it's quite a different experience. And by children, I mean anyone under the age of 18. Now, I appreciate there is a difference between a 5-year-old and a 17-year-old, say. But as minors, they're they're both subject to certain legal restrictions which impact on their experience of migration and also on their ability to participate in transnational practices. Firstly, children will have had far less agency in the process of changing country. It may have been discussed with them, and certainly some of the children I spoke to said their parents had discussed the option of moving to the UK with them. These are usually older teenagers. But they aren't the ones who will have made the decision to leave or the decision where to go. The way in which children may have moved or been moved can also have been extremely disruptive. They might have moved as part of the whole nuclear family, or just been sent unaccompanied to live with another relative already in the host country. For many, the father may have moved first to find work and establish a base before the rest of the family join him. And in a Polish context, this is a pattern that was noticed in migration patterns at the beginning of this century, the 2000s, but increasingly, interestingly enough, it's now very often the mother who will have made the decision to leave and move with the children, with the father more reluctant to move and who's ended up staying behind. Something else is education. Now, children's education may have been disrupted not only by changing schools that you'd expect anyway, but entire education systems. And this is going to leave them with less in common with the friends that they've left behind. Now, many of the conversations that children have, and particularly adolescents, center on school. You compare test results, you discuss the subjects you're planning to take, you mention teachers. But when they're attending not only different schools, but different systems, that whole topic of conversation has been taken away. And this can affect children's ability to stay in touch with friends with whom they may find themselves to have increasingly little in common. As an adult, you retain your friendships perhaps a little more. With children at this stage, it can be quite difficult. There's also a problem of language, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later. And this can be a problem when a person undergoes language attrition or when a person starts to lose their first language. And as the earlier list suggested, many of the transnational practices that are mentioned are often adult activities, sending money, increased mobility, and so forth. So what does transnationalism actually mean for children? As we mentioned earlier, different individuals will participate in different practices, whether they're adults or children. For some people, adults or children, transnationalism may be completely irrelevant. They may have no wish to remain in contact with the country from which they came for personal reasons, political reasons. Perhaps the impossibility of return makes them decide not to maintain contact, or perhaps they're simply unable to. In regard to children, we need to ask how far they're able to take part in such practices and whether they even want to. If you leave a country at the age of 5, particularly with your family, it may feel very irrelevant to you. A teenager might not want to immerse themselves in the host country so as not to stand out or to feel different from the children that they're with. They don't necessarily want to be tied to the country of origin. And in the current context, the restrictions imposed as a result of the pandemic may be impacting not only on transnational practices, but also on the activities available to children. Now, the research I'm going to talk about in a little while is based on my own research in Polish migration. So here I'd like to give a brief background to the Polish context. There are several waves of Polish migration to the UK throughout the 19th and 20th century, and some of the largest communities, for example, in Manchester and London, were established in the 19th century, and these provided hubs for later migrants, including the establishment of Saturday schools. In the 20th century, a large Polish community was established during the Second World War, and this grew up mainly around Air Force bases where Polish soldiers had been stationed during the war. This then was followed by the 1947 Polish Resettlement Act, which gave Polish nationals living in Britain at the time a legal right to abode and work in the UK. So during the era of the Soviet Union, Poles who chose to emigrate to the UK were therefore able to find several well-established communities across the country. And while there was limited migration during this period due to stringent visa requirements, following the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the years after the 1989 collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of unofficial movement between Poland and the UK. And this was mainly comprised of young single men who often took on manual work in order to earn money with which to return home. However, once Poland joined the European Union in 2004, they obtained the right of free movement, and this led to an exponential increase in the number of Poles coming to the UK. A great many came, increasingly with their families, but also with flexible plans, a sort of let's see how it goes policy. And arguably because of this, there was a need to maintain home contacts as well as establishing new networks within the host country. So this idea of transnationalism, living between two spaces, maintaining an emotional and a tangible connection between the home and host country became extremely pertinent. Now, beyond this, Polish organizations in the UK encouraged Poles to keep up connections with home. And this took many forms. Staying in touch physically was also facilitated by the increase in air routes, particularly from the low-cost airlines, which allowed for cheap and convenient transport. Ryanair, for example, increased the number of flights per day and to and from different destinations in Poland and the UK. So frequent visiting became far simpler. And this in turn led to a rise in transnational parenting, where parents might travel for work and leave children with grandparents, or even send them to relatives already in the UK. And so again, it was important for these links to be maintained. It facilitated the way money or goods could be sent back, or familiar food being sent. And of course, as well as flying, people could drive across Europe as well, and that made it easier. But once again, these are primarily activities dictated or regulated by adults and accessible to adults. For children, it's a different matter. So as part of my larger research project, I examined these issues with a group of Polish-born children now living in the UK. The project was actually conducted in 2016, which, as we probably remember, was just before the Brexit referendum in June of that year. And the participants I spoke to were all based in small Polish communities. One of them was established during the Second World War, and the other was actually a post-2004 settlement. As part of the research, I interviewed a group of Polish-English bilingual teenagers between the ages of 11 and 16. They were all currently at secondary school, and some of them had actually also attended primary school in the UK as well. And they were studying for the Polish GCSE, and a couple of them actually for A-level. Discussions were in small groups, and we had some individual interviews, and I asked them to talk about their experiences. Now, before I move on to what they said, this shows some brief biographical details about each of the participants. And a major point of interest in relation to the topic of transnationalism is how many of the children had parents living in different countries at certain times in their lives. So for Beata and Tomasz and Yamina, their fathers came to work in the UK for several years before the rest of the family was able to join them. And this is quite a long period of time, for 7 years, for 10 years, with the family still living back in Poland. And although it's not noted here, Philip actually came to the UK before his parents and stayed with an aunt in Southeast England for a time. And then if we look back for Marek and Anna, their parents divorced, with their mother working in England and their fathers back in Poland. So this idea of trying to have one foot in each country is very relevant to their experiences. So how do they all stay in touch? There were 4 main ways that I'm going to talk about that they maintained contact: visits, Polish language classes, technology, and football. And I'm going to talk a little about each of these in turn, but then also the challenges that these ways presented. So as I mentioned earlier, one way that allows people to remain in touch, and that's often mentioned in the discussions about Polish migration, is that of increased mobility. And now here we're obviously talking pre-pandemic, but the number of flights between Poland and the UK had increased exponentially, with cheap airlines such as Ryanair capitalizing on the growing Polish market. And certainly this facilitates the whole family, not just young single people traveling to and from Poland for work in the UK and returning as and when. The teenagers I spoke to talked about frequent family visits, going to Poland throughout the year at Christmas, Easter, maybe even during a half-term break, and especially for the long summers. Convenient flight routes also allow older relatives to come to the UK. Christina was very excited about her grandmother's visit that Easter, which was going to be a surprise for her younger brother. Her grandmother actually lived in France, where she'd been for a number of years, and her other grandmother lived in Italy. So the family had a great deal of experience in maintaining relationships across different European countries. Yamina also spoke about her grandparents, describing their first visit abroad and their apprehension at visiting the UK, especially since they spoke no English. Now, Yamina actually had a Polish mother and an Algerian father, and her family had the habit of traveling to each country on alternate years. So again, this notion of maintaining contacts through different countries was extremely pertinent to her. Another way that can be considered of maintaining connection and a sense of identity is through language. And for the Polish children, as for other communities, one way of doing this is through attending complementary Saturday schools. Now, one rule of these schools is to maintain a sense of community and to maintain Polish identity through teaching students about culture and celebrating national holidays. But their key component is usually language teaching. In the case of Polish schools, this includes teaching GCSE and sometimes A-level classes. And while there's sometimes resistance among teenagers to attend such classes, the teenagers I spoke to all emphasized the importance of them, of maintaining their Polish language skills in order to communicate with friends and family in Poland. So again, this was exemplified by Christina, who was adamant in her wish to keep up Polish, saying, I wouldn't want to forget the language. I have a lot of family that are still there, and I definitely want to keep in contact with them. And as we noted with Yamina's grandparents, however widespread the teaching of English has become, many children have relatives who don't speak English. There are also other reasons for maintaining the language, such as that given by Richard, who imagines a future whereby he may return for work. He envisages becoming an architect who can then return and build his own house. But if that fails, he can become an English teacher. And so the sense of maintaining an ongoing relationship with Poland as somewhere they may return to, as well as somewhere where family lives, is evidently very important to these young people. Probably the easiest way of staying in touch, as we've all learnt this year, is through technology. This can be on a personal level using Skype, FaceTime, texting. There was an interesting discussion we had about using Polish autocorrect to avoid spelling mistakes in Polish. Tomasz was very frustrated by all the diacritics, the marks on the various letters in the Polish alphabet, and autocorrect just solved that for him. Many of the children also had satellite television and described keeping up with Polish TV series, which their parents often watched. They also interestingly demonstrated quite a strong interest in Polish current affairs and the political situation in Poland. And this would form the basis of their conversations with family back in Poland, such as Marek's example of discussing politics, where he says, my uncle just explains it to me like briefly, so I can actually understand what's bad and good from there. And so this is part of sort of building up this sense of who he is, where he's coming from. It's also an example of a transnational practice that involves the need for language skills in order to understand the TV programs or the websites, and then also to be able to discuss them with family back in Poland. Another perhaps lighter way that was mentioned was through football. So a number of the boys followed the careers of Polish players in the Premier League. Perfect example where everybody mentioned Szczęsny, the former Arsenal goalkeeper, but there were several names that came up. Tomasz actually still followed his local team in Poland, and this was something he could then share with his family, who regularly attend the matches. As he says, it's like my uncle's a very big supporter, my cousin's a very big supporter. It's like all the family. So it goes like nearly all the matches. And even if Tomasz can't be there with them, he can follow the fortunes of his team, which interestingly he's still referred to as his local team, even though he'd actually spent half his life in the UK. He was 12. So for this group of teenagers, remaining in touch with Poland is very much an important part of their lives, and they've all developed some form of transnational practices. They've found different ways of keeping contact and of maintaining their sense of their own Polish identity, often in tandem with the new identity they're fashioning through their lives in the UK. However, while this all sounds very positive and lovely, with each of these ways, there is a flip side. And here I've sort of gathered them into three main areas: restrictions on visiting, language attrition, and the emotional impact. So to look at visiting first, in terms of mobility and travel, it's important to recognise that children do not share the experience of flexible mobility that's a characteristic of the young single migrant or even of their adult parents. This simply is not the experience of a teenager. While adults can travel alone, by law, teenagers can't just hop on a plane whenever they want, passport in hand. There's also the school timetable to consider, which restricts times that visits can be scheduled. And while school holidays are fairly frequent, it's not that children can just go anytime. There is also, in contrast to the cheap flights that were once commonplace, a growing increase in the price of flying. And this is something which was happening even before the pandemic. Now, again, for a single passenger, it might not be so prohibitive, but for a family, it all begins to add up. And the children are aware of this. As Sylvia explains, there's a situation for her family that this now places a limit on the number of visits they're able to make. So she says, we visit every year, half term in August. And now I think we can't because we have too little money and the aeroplane tickets are now too much money. Every year it goes more and more money for the aeroplane, so we don't think we're going to go this year. And a number of the others talked about taking the car as a cheaper option to flying. But if you wanted to go through a half-term holiday of a week, it's not really a viable option. The second issue is that of language. Now, while the teenagers I spoke to were all attending Polish language classes, attendance at such school is not necessarily as widespread as the experiences of one small group might suggest. Moreover, even if the children are attending classes and speaking Polish at home, it became apparent that English was becoming their dominant language, and many of them spoke of losing some of their Polish. And this notion of language attrition or losing a language is especially pertinent for children and teenagers who may not have acquired a particularly strong basis in their first language if they moved during primary school, or increasingly who were born in the UK. And this would therefore affect the use of technology, which relies on using the spoken word via Skype, the written word through texting or emailing. It's wonderful to be able to stay in touch in that way, but if there's a language issue, it becomes slightly harder to maintain that connection. Another issue is the emotional impact. Now, it may be physically easy to be transported from one country to another and back again, but the emotional impact of that needs to be acknowledged. And here Marek speaks about his own experience. Now, his parents are separated. His mother's a nurse in the UK. His father, with whom he has a close relationship, is in Poland and doesn't intend leaving. And while Marek enjoys seeing him, having to leave each year is a difficult experience. As he explains, well, I go to Poland and then, I don't know, I come back from Poland, I get over it, and then it's back to normal. It's every year's the same. I've learned to deal with it. I'm just, well, I'll go and come back, and then next year will be the same. And he finds that transition at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer extremely difficult. So while there are several ways of staying in touch and maintaining these various transnational practices, they're not without challenges. So how does this translate into the current situation in the midst of a global pandemic? And how have these transnational practices been affected? Now, on the one hand, it's perhaps too early to tell the long-term effects of the pandemic on transnational practices. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to return to that original group of children that I interviewed in 2016 to see how they were managing. However, from a study I've recently been conducting over the last year with Anne White at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, investigating how Polish Saturday schools in the UK have been coping during the various lockdowns, certain trends have actually emerged. These regard visiting, language learning, and emotional impact. So in terms of visiting and putting the present situation with quarantine and passports to one side, vaccination passports to one side, when I spoke to people at the schools, it was possible for visits to go ahead last summer, so summer 2020, when there were still regular flights to and from Poland. And this allowed children to see grandparents or friends in Poland. Some parents had actually been able to follow their usual practice of accompanying the children to Poland, leaving them with relatives, and then coming to pick them up at the end of the summer. However, it wasn't certain at that point. I spoke to people in November. It wasn't certain that they were going to be able to travel at Christmas. And in the current situation, it's still very unclear what will be happening at Easter and even going forward into the summer, given the changing laws, the vaccine passports, all of these different issues in the UK, in Poland, and so forth. The impact on this of not seeing family, which is something that we can perhaps all relate to, is even more difficult when you are so far apart and when the possibility of travelling becomes that more difficult. Also, as has been well documented in the media, the crisis in the airline industry pandemics engendered has led to a reduction in air routes, restricted timetables, and also cheaper fares may be a thing of the past. On top of that, there's going to be the impact of Brexit, which I'm not going to go into here, but that's also expected to have an effect on mobility to and from European countries. What about learning Polish? So another transnational practice I highlighted earlier is that of maintaining the Polish language. And this too has been affected by the pandemic. Now, starting in March last year, many Saturday schools have actually been able to move online, but not all of them, and several have closed. Even for those that have managed to remain open, there's been an overall decrease in the number of students, and schools have faced the same problems of online teaching and learning that are affecting all types of educational establishments. This includes questions of student motivation, the efficacy of studying in front of a screen, simply being too tired from the week to face another session of online learning on Saturday. And this is reflected in the number of students sitting Polish GCSEs. At the moment, it's uncertain what the situation is going to be for the exams this coming June, and that uncertainty may also put students off. Nonetheless, many schools have kept going. Those I spoke to during the November lockdown were determined to continue online and had redoubled their efforts to do so. Some even reported having an increase in enrolment in September 2020 when schools were briefly allowed to reopen. But whether this has been sustained through the winter lockdowns, whether numbers bounce back post-pandemic, is something that will need to be monitored. And as we discussed, if you don't have the language to stay in contact, having those deeper relationships, whatever the technology, becomes that much harder. And here we come to the point of technology. Now, a further impact on transnational relationships, and something with which I think we can all sympathise in some way, is the one from which we're all suffering. But it's actually a question that was raised several years ago, pre-pandemic. So while technology is presented as the panacea to the problem of staying in touch, can this really replicate the physical intimacy of everyday contact? The transnational argument has tended to posit that having fast communication at our fingertips, staying in touch is easy, and so maintaining contact is really the same as being there, and so people living in one country don't really miss out too much. But as I think we've all realised this year, celebrating a birthday or trying to maintain a relationship over Skype is just not the same. However fantastic it is, technology is a very poor substitute for being in the same physical space as someone else. For teenagers and young people, the months of lockdown have been a particularly difficult time as they've been cut off from their friends at just the point that they're trying to establish a social and emotional life which is independent from that of their parents. And for those living in another country, there's an additional layer of difficulty, especially for those who have been separated from other family members. Now, we've already seen the impact of trying to maintain relationships across countries when visiting is possible. So emotionally, how much harder will it have become by the time the intensity of the pandemic passes? So to bring everything together and to return to the original argument of this talk, it's clear that children and teenagers do often participate in transnational practices, and that for at least the teenagers that I spoke to, developing some type of transnational identity remains important to them. But the way it's manifested may differ for each person. And this echoes previous scholarship on adults, which argues that each person maintains their own transnational practices depending on their individual needs, abilities, circumstances, and so forth. However, again, it needs to be realized that the activities which are allowed and available to teenagers are more restricted than those available to adults. It also needs recognizing that the pandemic and the restrictions resulting from it have made it harder to maintain some of these practices. On the one hand, the sterling efforts of the Polish Saturday schools that continue to operate under trying conditions need acknowledging for the way that so many schools have endeavored to maintain a sense of community and connection during the lockdowns. However, the strains on transnational relationships has been immense, as it has for many relationships during this year. And given the experiences of this past year, we can perhaps all understand a little more, if not completely, the impact of being forcibly away from friends and family, of being unable to be with them during illness, and also being away from familiar places for long periods of time. However inventive and adept we've become at finding ways of staying in touch with those closest to us, having that enforced separation and a reliance on technology for maintaining communication has made us realize its limitations. And with that realization, a glimpse into some of the challenges that transnationals can experience in terms of trying to maintain relationships across countries. To end on a more positive note, though, it's encouraging to see that teenagers do find their own ways of maintaining transnational identities, and that there have been ways of facilitating this even through the pandemic. However, the emotional impact of living across 2 or more countries, especially for teenagers, cannot be ignored. But perhaps we can draw our own experiences from the past year and become more understanding of the challenges that they face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a really interesting talk. We have got several questions here for you, which if I can just read out, you may be able to respond to. Okay, so one of the viewers has asked, do you consider that sometimes people are unaware that there is a difficulty, I'm guessing, with maintaining transnational identities, perhaps due to their lack of knowledge?
I think so very much. I mean, as I say, my work with teenagers also makes me aware of the fact that their friends don't even always know what's going on. And so I think it is something that does need highlighting. I think for people who've had less experience of this or very limited experience, it's quite difficult trying to grasp that idea of what it's like to be having one foot in one place and one foot in another, which is why I say this, however difficult this year has been, it's given us some idea of what it's like when you can't even see a relative in Manchester, never mind another country. So yes, I think there is a lack of realization that needs to be looked at.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question here. So Katie asks, how far did religion or the church play a role in building connections with Poland and Polishness for these teens that you interviewed?
With teens, I'm not sure as much. Certainly, as Katie probably knows, there is a large church base here and a lot of the communities are connected with the church. And it's used very much as a community centre as much as a religious centre. The teenagers I spoke to saw it very much as somewhere that their parents dragged them on a Sunday. which I think is probably maybe a teenage thing rather than anything else. So it does play a role, but again, it may be more for adult members of the community rather than teenagers at that point, although it could be something to which they return. It would be interesting to actually look at that and see how many of them have found that as a base and they find themselves going back to it as something that they've done. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so this is another question, we've got a few anonymous ones here. How do teenagers view or use their available linguistic resources, especially during the lessons at the complementary schools? Great question.
Okay, at the complementary schools, I'm going to say it depends, which always sounds like a bit of a cop-out to an answer, but in some ways it does. It divides very much into those people, those children who've come, who were born in Poland and had some education there and who sort of already speak it. And so they come into a classroom much more comfortable with the idea of using Polish straight the way through, even if it's slightly broken or it's slightly imperfect, they will sort of, they know how that works. For the newer generation, and that's actually the brothers and sisters of the teenagers I was talking about, they were born in the UK. And so to them, being in a Polish-only environment where they've got no recourse to English, they find quite difficult. And so I have a feeling that what's going on is they may be drawing more on their English as well as their Polish in those lessons. Now, the only class I've actually observed was going on in a state school, one of the few state schools to give Polish classes, and that was, bar one or two words, entirely in Polish. And English was very much not something that was encouraged. But as I say, with the newer generation who've had no education in Poland, it may be a question of a sort of bilingual approach rather than a monolingual approach.
I'm just going to pick you up on that because I found that's a really interesting dynamic that you're introducing there. So do you find that there's a tension within families between children who have maybe moved to the UK and have a basis basic understanding of Polish as they grew up there and they moved here maybe when they were 10 or 11, and younger siblings who've never had exposure to Polish? Does that cause a tension? I'm just going to do another question straight after that, sorry, if I may, to say, is there ever a rejection of Polish?
Yes, I'm going to say yes to both of those.
Okay.
Let me deal with the tension thing first, and then I'll move on to the idea of rejection. So in terms of the tension, you often got this sort of shift, and I felt it between some of the teenagers I interviewed, and they would talk about, well, my brother's not very good at Polish, but I'll help him improve on this. Or he's very good at English, but I don't know what we are going to do about his Polish. It was like, well, me and my family, we're going to need to do something with him. And it was almost, there was that separation between, okay, the English-born one and the Polish-born one. Now, I've not done enough research to make that an absolute, but it's certainly something that I observed, that slight sense of, well, it's also a question of lived experience. I think if you've lived in a country till you're 6 or 7, then you go and live in another country, and then your younger brother or sister is born who has no experience of the country in which you were born in the same way. That must create some sense of, it's not just a question of not having a shared experience, but such a different experience. And I'd be quite interested to look into research into that. In terms of rejection, certainly. I mean, I'm talking about teenagers I interviewed because they were available. There were a number of teenagers in the school that I went to who wanted nothing to do with it, who changed their surnames because they were considered too noticeably Polish, and who really didn't want to learn the language. And that happens also with complementary schools. I mean, the research on complementary schools will say that sometimes teenagers are sort of dragged there. What often happens, and people studying this probably already know, is that they might go as children and then they get to sort of 11, 12, go into secondary school, and suddenly it's like, oh, do I have to go? It interferes with their social life on a Saturday or their Friday nights. And so there is an issue of rejection. And I don't know, with the decrease in numbers during the pandemic, I don't know if what impact that might have too.
Thank you. We actually received a question. I think it came in a little bit after I'd given you my response, for Veronica, and I think you may have answered some of her question partially. She asked, have you ever encountered family conflicts around teenagers not wanting to maintain transnational identity and ties, i.e. being forced to study Polish? So did you feel that many children were forced to study Polish? And is transnational identity inextricably linked to language, would you say? Or could you, what is that relationship? Could you reject a language but not your identity? Or are they too interwoven?
There are two parts of that question. So the sort of easy part to start with of the rejection, what often happened is that, yes, there was rejection, and those were the ones I simply didn't get to see, which suggests there is a rejection going on. I think what sometimes happens with the teenagers, though, is that sort of after that age of sort of 12, 13, they suddenly realise that they get an extra GCSE quite easily. And suddenly it became I don't necessarily want to be doing this, but hey, this is going to help. So it became an extrinsic reason for doing it. They wanted it for something for themselves. And that sometimes, brought them back to it. As for that link with language, it's a very tricky one, I would argue, to unpick. Is the rejection of the rejection of a language can often be seen as the rejection of an identity. And there's been research on this about people, particularly who've left sort of war-torn countries, very often reject the language of that country because that's something they do not want to think about. So it can be seen as that, but I think there is still scope to maintain some sort of identity and some connection with back home, which isn't wholly reliant on language. I think the example of football is probably a very good one. It's not like a television program or current affairs where you're going to have to understand something of what's going on. Much more visual than that. So I think there is potential to do that. And it might be, in a sense, that might be quite a nice way of maintaining that bridge without there being too much tension. It's a sort of link back home, which could be exploited later on, but doesn't need to be.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got another question here from, we've got several more questions. Could you talk a bit more about Polish language classes and how they are funded? Are they funded by the schools or by the community? And how do they make the shared experience of transnationalism?
Okay, so funding, it's not something I know about too much in detail. It usually comes from parents' fees. But the initial money often comes from the founders. They may have got a grant. It happens in various ways. So some schools will get a grant from various not research bodies, but educational bodies. They may be Polish, they may be UK, to build up something as part of the community. They then rely on fees. I don't want to go into it too much here, but that also caused a problem during the pandemic with student numbers going down. Fees were going down. And so trying to maintain that was quite difficult. So that's funding. Sorry, can you remind me of the second part of that question?
Yes, of course, sorry. How do they make the shared experience of transnationalism? How do they facilitate it, I think?
What they do is, as I said, as well as language lessons, they're also sort of community events. So it might be things like Independence Day celebrations or Children's Day or Easter. There's sometimes something called Easter Fun. There was one school I spoke to and they were making bunnies and painting eggs and doing the sort of traditional activities that they might expect to do back in Poland. Christmas, there'll be something going on for Christmas. So I think it's in celebrating festivals, celebrating religious festivals, but also festivals that are connected with the country and with the history. And there is an element of history education that goes on as well. The language education sort of overtakes that once they get to GCSE level. It's more for the younger children, but there is that sense of community. And parents are also encouraged to join in. Now that could either be with attending events, or it might just be helping in the school, sort of at break time, shepherding children around or sitting in corridors. So they do try and make it more of an inclusive event rather than just a language learning event.
Okay, great. Alex asks, how did you get into this field of research and what are you planning to do next?
Okay, so I got into it because I was looking at language and identity originally, but actually in a different context. And then due to various reasons, I decided to base my research in the UK and thought, well, Polish teenagers are an interesting lot. There was a lot of work on Polish migration, but not very much on teenagers. That's changed over the last few years. So I sort of got into it that way. What I do next, at the moment, I'm still very much involved with this project on the schools during lockdown. And we're doing some writing on the data that we've collected, which has got a lot. I did a lot of the interviews during the lockdown in November, and I think because everyone just needed someone to talk to, I got a lot of information and people just talking endlessly about many, many things. So the next thing really is to sift through the data and come up with a couple of articles and presentations. So that's where that's moving to. Beyond that, I'm not sure yet.
Okay, we've also had an inquiry about receiving the PowerPoint slides.
I don't know if that can be facilitated. I'm happy to do so if that can be facilitated. So I think that's one that we'll have to get back to you on, but I don't have a problem sharing them.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, another question from Veronica. Polls talking about return often give children's wishes as an argument in favour of returning. Is it confirmed by your research on teenagers? Do many people dream of return?
Okay, this is a complicated one in that it's actually changed over the last year.
Okay.
So in terms of when I started, or when I did that original piece of research back in 2016, and that was pre the referendum. So it was still very much this thinking of, no, I want to stay here. And the children often, I mean, they're established in school, so they'd really like to carry on and do their A-levels and go to college here or go to university. And so they saw that trajectory. And then possibly returning later, as one girl put it, when I'm very old and I'm 50, I might like to return. So they have it sort of in their mind as some sort of the myth of return, I suppose. But I think parents were loath perhaps to take them out of school. And again, that comes back to language. If you've been used to one education system and lost a little bit, and then you're thrown back into another one. I remember one of the girls saying, how am I even going to cope? I wouldn't know what was on the board or what was being given to me. What's happened in the last year is a sort of conflation of Brexit and pandemic. So with Brexit, families were beginning to leave and go, hang about, this just isn't going to work, or I can't make it work. What happened with the pandemic is that back in March, they saw what was happening in this country compared to what was happening in Poland, thought they'd probably be better off there. And a lot of people decided to leave and go back, because at that point there were regular flights to Poland. And in fact, there was a bit of an initiative from the government saying, if you'd like to come back, please do, that's fine. There are flights will take you. And it prompted decisions that were sort of in the back of people's mind. I think that may have died out now insofar as people who were going to go will have gone. And the sort of confirmation of Brexit of January this year, so 21, may not have made that much difference, but that's something we'll have to wait and see. Okay.
Okay, we've reached the end of our questions. Does anyone else have any more questions that they would like to ask Sarah before the end of the session?
Something I just would add to what I've just said is the other thing to factor in is what's happening in Poland. Again, I'm not going to go into this, partly it's not time, but also there's a lot going on politically and socially in Poland. And that made some people who were thinking of returning decide that they really didn't want to. So there are various factors at play here. It's not quite as simple as just going, I've got children, therefore I will do this. It's almost, I've got children, I'm not sure if I want them to grow up in that environment. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple things going on.
Yeah, I can see it's quite a complex issue. Veronica makes one more note, which is that the loss of income from Saturday school fees will reduce the budgets of diasporic organisations and their ability to organise kind of integration events. Is that something you're finding, or there are indications of potentially?
I think, sorry to interrupt, yes, I think so. I mean, the ones I spoke to were very much, we are going for this. If we have to go online, we'll go online. We'll just get people in, we will manage, we will find a way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, partly online, they weren't always then having to pay for premises because they have to rent out premises for Saturday school.
Yes.
If they're online, they don't have to do that. So that was one thought. They didn't seem to be, when I say there didn't seem to be huge concern, it sort of came and went, I suppose, like everything this year. Sometimes it felt like a panic, other times it didn't. But I think it is a concern and something that needs monitoring, as well as the fact that some schools have just closed, shut down and said, that's it, we can't manage this. So I think there is something there that means that the community can't take advantage of that as well. Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a really interesting talk today. I'm sure, judging by the responses, that people have been really engaged with your conversation and your topic. Wishing you all the luck with the rest of your research.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the questions, the people who attended. And thank you for doing this, Emma, as well.
You're welcome. Anytime. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I think this will be available on